Hi guys! Welcome to your next lesson in Topic 5, Soil Systems and Society. Today we are going to talk about terrestrial food production and food choice. So this is a huge topic and a huge part of life. Again, like we said in the aquatic systems topic, this is really a marriage of human societies and ecosystem management. Because if we don't manage resources in a way that we are able to be provided with food as a world population, we are going to run into problems really, really quickly. So let's get started talking about this topic. The first thing that's important to consider when you talk about terrestrial food production is where does your food come from? And there are a few different ways that can be classified. You can talk about subsistence farming, and we don't see that very much anymore, sort of living off the land. And you can also talk about commercial farming. And it's likely if you live in the first world that a lot of your food comes from the grocery store and is produced by commercial farming systems. That can be people cash cropping subsistence crops and selling them, or people purposefully growing out a system that really has nothing to do with local sustainable food production. It's just for exchange with money. In terms of using animals as food, you can talk about pastoral farming and arable farming. And this is a big use of land in our world now, is raising crops to feed directly to animals without having any of those crops go to feeding people. So when you look at world food production and this idea of producing crops, there are 13.5 billion hectares of land on the earth. The most productive biomes to grow crops are obviously sort of around the equator because that's where we get the most insolation and the most water, as we talked about before. You also see a tremendous amount of productivity happening in I'm a little bit too low there, happening in grassland ecosystems, both in the northern hemisphere and in the southern hemisphere. Since there's more land in the northern hemisphere, there's generally more food production in the northern hemisphere because there's more plants there. Looking at world food production and a map, there are some big differences between less and more economically developed countries in terms of how they produce food. Let's see if I remember to do my pen. I did. So less economically developed countries are more likely to rely on this idea of subsistence farming. More ecologically developed countries are more likely to rely on commercial agriculture. And they have a different breakdown of the amount of calories that they take in and where those calories come from. That is pretty significant. And something that the IB asks students to do a lot is compare a subsistence and commercial, a more economically developed and a less economically developed way of getting food. So take a minute to look at this comparison chart between intensive beef production in Argentina, so beef production for commercial use, and extensive beef production by the Maasai tribe of East Africa, beef production that's mostly just for the local population. The inputs are much more significant in an intensive system. The outputs are much greater because of those significant inputs. But the system characteristics are not great. It's usually a pretty unsustainable system because if you weren't funneling money into this system, it would totally fall apart and stop working. You're relying really heavily on technology and other sort of sources of ingenuity to create food instead of just using as much of the animal as you can and using your land as sustainably as possible. So the environmental impacts are obviously greater in intensive food production efforts. In this case, you have to deal with deforestation because you need a place to grow the crops that you're going to feed the cattle. So people cut down rainforests for that. It's actually one of the most significant reasons that there is deforestation happening in the Amazon rainforest right now. And also there's a lot of waste produced. And when we look at the significant sources of waste, sewage is a really big problem. Animal sewage contains a lot of different substances that are very harmful for the environment. Um, Extensive beef production, sort of sustainable farming is obviously not as bad for the environment, but there is some impact on the land because anytime that you are growing meat, there is going to be some impact on the land. The most sustainable thing to do is grow vegetables because there is the least amount of energy transfer happening from what's like happening from layer to layer of a food web or food chain when you are growing vegetables. So let's take a look at our next slide if you have a good idea of how to compare those two systems. And this talks a little bit more generally about the problems with food production. So the first is an equitable supply because we produce enough food to feed the world, but it's hard to get it around. Transportation and spoilage are a big problem. And also the idea that in the production of this food, we're using soil way too fast. Because remember, that's the focus of our chapter is soil systems and society. So for now, we're able to produce enough food to feed the planet, but at what cost? As scientists and farmers start to understand the difficulties faced by using so much soil, people are trying to increase sustainability of food supplies. And there's a few different ways to do this. Obviously, you want to be maximizing your yield by improving technologies and altering what people grow. This is a good argument for genetically modified foods because they're going to be genetically engineered to waste the least energy. You can also talk about reducing food waste. So that problem of spoilage, we need to find ways around that where we're not wasting any food either in production and storage or in consumption. Like when you go to the grocery store and just buy too much food, that is a big waste of food that costs a lot of money and could be going to someone that really needs something to eat. You can also look at monitoring and control of food systems. This is obviously anthropocentric. And then changing our attitudes towards food is a pretty significant problem that I think the world is going to face. Because now people think that eating a lot of meat is a high status symbol. And people need to stop thinking that way because we don't have enough meat on the planet to feed 8 billion people. We just don't. So when you consider increasing sustainability of food supplies, these are all good things to take into account. There is a lot of unsustainable food production going on in the world now, and the IB occasionally asks for sort of case study examples of that. So let's go over one, which is basically a devil crop known as palm oil. So these are palm oil palm trees, and you can see the breakdown of the fruit in here has the shell and then the kernel oil and the palm oil that can be squeezed out of the flesh of this fruit. So palm oil was initially a subsistence crop that was grown mostly in West Africa and was great for small local use causes. But when people realized that palm oil could be used as sort of an additive to keep foods at the consistencies that we wanted them, palm oil production spun totally out of control. And since the 1970s, we've seen an increase in palm oil plantations in Malaysia and Indonesia that's almost doubled global production. And this causes rapid deforestation because people are cutting down the rainforest to make room for these palm oil plantations, and also threats to species like the Sumatran orangutan. You guys might remember when there were some bad fires in Indonesia in about 2012, there were some really heartbreaking pictures of Sumatran orangutans being carried out of the forests that were their homes, and we're doing that voluntarily to them every day because of our diet. So when you talk about that idea of a flagship species, the orangutan family are good for that because I think a lot of people see the genetic similarities between humans and different primate species. So think about that the next time that you need to go to the grocery store and pick out some food and think about if palm oil products are worth it or not. Your homework for this lesson is if you're following along in the book, you should be reading pages 245 to 253. And then in terms of comprehension, you should make sure that you can compare and contrast inputs, outputs, system characteristics, and environmental impacts for 2 named food production systems. And you can do that in longhand or you can do that in a table response. And remember, compare is similarities and contrast is differences. So give that a try, and when you are ready, you can go to the review video to check your work. See you there.